when two men who had never truly forgiven each other found themselves under the same studio lights, even a polite smile could sound like an insult. And sometimes it wasn't the loud confrontations that ended a show, was the quiet, carefully chosen words that landed like a final blow. The Jonathan Ross Show had witnessed its fair share of uncomfortable television moments over the years. Awkward jokes, ill-timed laughter, guests who talked too much or too little. But that night carried a different kind of electricity. It wasn't explosive or chaotic. It was subtle, restrained, polished on the surface, the kind of tension that didn't announce itself but lingered in the air like unfinished business. Waiting patiently for the smallest spark, Prince Harry arrived first. He walked onto the stage dressed in a dark, tailored suit, the collar of his shirt open, no tie. Casual but deliberate, relaxed but controlled. His expression was composed. As he offered the audience a brief wave, the applause was warm, supportive, respectful, but not overwhelming. Harry acknowledged it with a nod and took his seat, crossing his legs with practiced calm. Up close, he looked settled, almost serene. But the calm felt rehearsed, like armor polished through repetition. Jonathan Ross leaned toward him, smiling. "Icily, Harry, welcome. It's good to have you." "Good to be here," Harry replied. His voice was steady, his tone friendly. His eyes swept the studio once, as if taking inventory. The opening minutes flowed smoothly. Jonathan asked about Harry's recent projects, his life in California, his work with charities, his ongoing advocacy for mental health. Harry answered with confidence and clarity, slipping easily into the familiar rhythm of someone accustomed to telling his story on his own terms. He spoke about healing, about growth, about moving forward. The audience nodded along, appreciative, engaged. Then Jonathan smiled just slightly and shifted in his chair. "In joining us tonight," he said, glancing toward the opposite side of the stage, is a man who never struggles to tell his story. Jeremy Clarkson. The reaction was immediate. Cheers, laughter, a ripple of anticipation, and beneath it all, something sharper, something unsettled. Jeremy Clarkson walked out slowly, hands loosely clasped, wearing a dark brown blazer and that unmistakable half-smirk that always seemed to balance charm and provocation in equal measure. He waved casually to the crowd, soaking it in, then turned toward Harry. For a fraction of a second, neither man spoke. The silence stretched just long enough to be noticed. Jeremy broke it first. "Evening." Harry nodded once. Jeremy. 2 words. Polite, neutral, loaded. Jonathan felt it instantly. The temperature in the room shifted. The studio seemed to tighten around the two chairs now facing each other, as if the space itself had grown smaller. "Now," Jonathan said lightly, forcing brightness into his voice. "I know people at home will be thinking the same thing, so let's address it up front. Jeremy, you and Harry, you've got history." A ripple of laughter followed. "Nervous this time?" Harry didn't smile. Jeremy exhaled through his nose, a sound that almost but not quite resembled a chuckle. "I suppose that's one way to put it." Jonathan leaned back. "But you did apologize publicly. That's worth noting." Jeremy nodded. "I did, and I meant it." Harry tilted his head slightly, his eyes fixed on Jeremy. "Did you?" The question landed softly. No accusation in the tone. No raised voice. And yet it hit harder than anything shouted could have. Jeremy turned toward him unbothered. "Yes. Apologizing doesn't mean rewriting reality, Harry. It means acknowledging that words can go too far." Harry's jaw tightened, just enough to be visible. "Funny," he said calmly, "because some of your commentary didn't sound like words that went too far. It sounded like contempt." Jonathan raised a hand gently. "All right, let's keep this civil." Jeremy shrugged. "I don't dislike Harry. Never have. I criticize public behavior. It's my job." Harry let out a short, humorless laugh. "Right. The job of deciding who deserves empathy and who doesn't." The audience shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. A few people glanced at one another. Jeremy leaned back in his chair, unruffled. "You chose to live publicly. It chose to tell your story again and again. At some point, people are allowed to respond. Harry leaned forward slightly now, his posture changing. Responding is one thing, he said. Mockery is another. Jeremy met his gaze without blinking. Insensitivity has limits. There it was. The first real crack. Jonathan leaned forward again, trying to regain control. Let's slow this down. But Harry wasn't finished, I think, he said, eyes locked on Jeremy, voice still controlled, but noticeably colder. That some critics profit from misunderstanding? Jeremy smiled just a little, or maybe they profit. From clarity? Harry's smile disappeared entirely. You see, he continued, every word measured, this is exactly the problem. You dress cruelty up as honesty. Jeremy didn't hesitate. And you dress resentment up as virtue. Collective gasp rippled through the audience. Jonathan opened his mouth to intervene. But the moment had already slipped beyond him. Harry straightened. You apologized, he said. And yet here you are still positioning yourself as the arbiter of morality. Still framing harm as commentary. Jeremy's tone remained casual, almost bored. Apologies don't require silence afterward. They require acknowledgement. I gave that. And accountability, Harry asked quietly. Jeremy shrugged. Depends who's defining it. The room was completely silent now. No laughter, no applause. Just two men sitting under bright lights. Neither willing to blink first. Jonathan finally cleared his throat. Well, he said carefully, this has certainly become. It's more honest than expected. Harry leaned back, breaking eye contact at last. Honesty without responsibility, he said, is just another performance. Jeremy smiled again, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. And in that moment, everyone watching both in the studio and at home understood something clearly. This wasn't about an apology. It wasn't about criticism. And it certainly wasn't about moving on. It was about two men who had never forgiven each other finally realizing that no amount of politeness could hide it anymore. The cameras kept rolling. But the show, in all the ways that mattered, was already over. Is why people are so obsessed with asking how I'm affected. The sentence hung in the air, unfinished but unmistakably complete. Meghan Markle sat upright, her hands folded loosely in her lap, her expression calm but guarded. The studio lights reflected softly off the polished set, giving everything a warm glow that now felt slightly misleading. Lorraine blinked once. Well, she said gently, her practiced smile still in place. Our viewers are curious. Yes. Meghan replied without hesitation. They're curious. Right. But curiosity and judgment often get confused. She paused just long enough for the words to settle, sometimes intentionally. The temperature in the room shifted not dramatically, not visibly, but everyone felt it. It was the kind of chill that didn't come from hostility, but from precision. From someone choosing their words carefully and meaning every one of them. Lorraine maintained her smile, though it tightened at the edges. Years of live television had taught her how to hold a room steady, even when it began to drift. We're certainly not here to judge, she said calmly. We're here to listen. Meghan tilted her head slightly. I hope so. 2 words. Quiet, controlled, heavy. They landed with more force than a longer rebuttal ever could. Lorraine nodded, absorbing the moment, then attempted to steer the conversation back onto safer ground. There are still many people here who support you deeply, she offered. Meghan smiled again. But this time, it wasn't gratitude. It wasn't warmth. It was distance. Support, she said evenly, is not the same as understanding. Lorraine's hand drifted instinctively toward her cue cards. Not because she needed them, but because they gave her something to hold on to. The studio grew quieter. Even the subtle hum of movement behind the cameras seemed to fade. And one camera adjusted its angle, moving closer. Meghan's face filled the screen, her expression composed, eyes steady, and for the first time, became clear to everyone watching this interview might not stay under control. No one had raised their voice. No one had said anything overtly confrontational. And yet the tension was unmistakable. The kind that tightens slowly, deliberately, until it becomes impossible to ignore. Meghan knew it, Lorraine did too. Lorraine had been on television long enough to recognize the exact moment when a conversation quietly changed direction. It didn't announce itself. It didn't need to. It simply shifted, like a current beneath the surface, pulling everything off course. This was one of those moments. She adjusted slightly in her chair, still smiling, still composed, but no longer casual. Well, she said gently, her voice measured. Understanding often comes from conversation. That's what we're doing here today. Meghan nodded once. A small, deliberate movement. Conversation, she repeated, and added, yes, when it's actually a two-way street. Lorraine paused. Just a fraction of a second too long. She chose her next words carefully. Some people feel, she said slowly, that when questions are asked, you tend to see them as attacks rather than curiosity. The studio went very still. Meghan's posture straightened. Her hands separated slightly, palms resting flat against her knees. The movement was subtle, but it signaled something unmistakable. Focus, readiness. Her voice remained calm when she spoke, but it sharpened. That framing, she said, is exactly the problem. Lorraine raised her eyebrows slightly, still composed. How so? Because it assumes Meghan replied that the intent is neutral, and often it isn't. Lorraine kept her tone warm, almost reassuring. But surely not every question. Didn't say every question, Meghan interrupted, not loudly, not aggressively, but unmistakably. The interruption landed harder than any raised voice could have. A ripple passed through the audience, no sound, just awareness. Lorraine recovered smoothly. She always did. Of course, she said, but there's also a public interest element. You've chosen to speak publicly. You've shared your story. Smiled again. This time, there was no softness left in it. I've shared my story, she said. That doesn't mean I've given permission for it to be reshaped, dissected, or weaponized. Lorraine folded her hands together, nodding slowly. As though absorbing the point, the public conversation inevitably involves interpretation, she said. People will react differently. Reaction is one thing, Meghan replied. Reduction is another. The cameras inched closer again. Meghan's expression was steady now, resolute, not defensive, not emotional, just firm. For a long time, she continued, I was told that if I just explained myself better, if I answered more questions, if I stayed open, things would improve. And what I learned is that openness doesn't guarantee fairness. Lorraine listened, her smile now almost neutral. But don't you think, she asked carefully, that shutting down questions can reinforce mistrust? Meghan didn't hesitate. I think forcing people to constantly justify their pain creates it. The words hung there, suspended. Lorraine inhaled gently. We're not forcing anything here, she said. We're talking, yes, Meghan replied. But who defines? The terms of that conversation? Silence. Not awkward. Not hostile. Intentional. Lorraine glanced briefly at her cards again, then back at Meghan. I think people just want clarity, she said. Clarity for whom? Meghan asked quietly. And at what cost? The audience shifted again. A few heads nodded. Others remained still, unsure which way the moment would turn. Lorraine smiled, professional, controlled. We're almost out of time, she said lightly, as if trying to ease the weight that had settled over the studio. Meghan nodded. Then I'll say this, she said. Being visible doesn't mean being available for judgment. In conversation without accountability isn't dialogue, it's interrogation. Lorraine opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. She smiled once more, softer this time. Well, she said, thank you for sharing your perspective. Returned the smile, polite. Distant, as the cameras pulled back and the segment wrapped. Everyone watching understood something clearly. This wasn't an argument. It wasn't a meltdown. It wasn't even confrontation in the traditional sense. It was something quieter and far more unsettling. A conversation that slipped out of its expected shape. A guest who refused to play the familiar role. A moment where control didn't disappear, simply changed hands. Some viewers would say they're simply trying to understand the full picture. Lorraine's voice was even measured, the kind of neutrality perfected over decades of morning television. The words sounded reasonable, sensible, almost gentle. Meghan leaned back slightly in her chair, not defensively, deliberately. Her eyes remained steady, fixed on Lorraine with a calm that felt increasingly intentional. The full picture, Meghan said slowly, carefully separating each word, is usually code for the version that makes me more palatable. A murmur rippled through the studio. Not loud enough to disrupt the broadcast, not sharp enough to be called a reaction, but enough to be felt. A subtle shift. A recognition. Lorraine's expression tightened just a fraction. I don't think that's fair, she replied. Meghan tilted her head again, the gesture familiar by now. I think it's honest. Lorraine took a breath. She could feel it now. The moment when the interview crossed an invisible line. This was no longer a gentle morning chat. The polite rhythm had broken. She adjusted her posture, recalibrating. You've spoken openly about media pressure, she said, changing tack. But critics argue that you engage with the media when it suits you and condemn it when it doesn't. There it was. The studio seemed to contract around the question. Meghan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, not anger restraint. That argument, she said, comes from people who have never experienced scrutiny as surveillance. Lorraine nodded slowly, her voice still calm. But public figures still deserve dignity. Meghan cut in, and boundaries. Lorraine leaned forward now, unconsciously matching Meghan's posture. Boundaries, she said, don't always sit comfortably with public accountability. Meghan's eyes flashed just once. And accountability, she replied, shouldn't mean enduring endless character assassination. The air between them felt heavier now, charged, the kind of tension that didn't need volume to be unmistakable. Lorraine softened her tone instinctively. No one here is assassinating your character. Meghan didn't smile. Intent, she said, doesn't erase impact. The cameras caught at the shift. Meghan's shoulders squared. Her voice grew firmer, less conversational, more resolute, and frankly, she continued, I'm tired of being asked to explain my existence. Lorraine blinked. That's not what I'm asking. It's what it becomes, Meghan replied. Every time. Lorraine sat back slightly, lips pressed together. For the first time since the interview began, her smile faded completely. Well, she said evenly, we do have to ask questions. Meghan met her gaze without hesitation. And I don't have to accept the premise behind them. Silence. Not the comfortable kind that television producers welcome. The other kind? The kind that makes people behind the cameras shift their weight. Glance at monitors, quietly check time cues. Lorraine exhaled slowly. Then perhaps she said carefully, this isn't the right format for you. Meghan's eyebrows lifted slightly. Perhaps she replied, this format isn't used to being challenged. Lorraine straightened. The warmth was gone now. What remained was professionalism and friction. The interview hadn't exploded. No raised voices, no dramatic walkout. But the cracks were spreading, and both women knew it. The silence after Meghan's last remark stretched longer than Lorraine was comfortable with. Lorraine had interviewed politicians trained to deflect, grieving parents fighting to speak through, pain, celebrities navigating scandal and collapse. She knew how to regain control of a room, but this wasn't about control anymore. It was about authority. She leaned back, crossing one leg over the other. Challenging questions, she said, evenly, aren't an attack. They're part of the job. Meghan released a short breath through her nose. Not a laugh. Not a sigh. Something in between? Your job, she replied, doesn't require my submission. Lorraine's lips pressed into a thin line. No one is asking for submission, she said, but respect goes both ways. Meghan's eyes hardened. Respect, she said, starts with not framing someone as a problem to be solved. Lorraine raised an eyebrow. Are you saying you can't be questioned at all? Meghan shook her head slowly. No, she said. I'm saying the questions reveal more about the asker than the subject. The studio felt suspended in that moment, balanced precariously between restraint and rupture. Lorraine nodded once, slowly. I think people just want transparency. And I think Meghan replied that transparency is often demanded only from those who are already overexposed. Lorraine opened her mouth, then closed it again. She chose her next words with visible care. You understand, she said, that audiences expect answers. Meghan leaned forward slightly now, reclaiming the space. And I understand. She replied that expectation isn't the same as entitlement. Another silence. It's one longer. Lorraine glanced briefly toward the camera, then back at Meghan. We're running out of time, she said. Meghan nodded. Then let me be. Clear, she said calmly. I'm not refusing conversation. I'm refusing distortion. Lorraine inhaled, then exhaled. Well, she said, thank you for sharing your perspective. Meghan returned her gaze. Thank you, she replied, for finally listening. The words sounded polite. But everyone in the room understood what had just happened. This hadn't been a breakdown, it hadn't been hostility, and it certainly hadn't been chaos. It was something far more unsettling. A guest who refused to be managed. A host who realized the familiar rules no longer applied. And a conversation that quietly slipped beyond the shape it was supposed to hold. The cameras pulled back. The segment moved on. But the tension lingered unresolved, unmistakable long after the studio lights dimmed. Meghan leaned forward now, fully engaged, her posture no longer relaxed but intentional. I'm saying, she answered steadily, that I won't sit here and be dissected for morning entertainment. Lorraine's tone shifted. The warmth softened into something sharper, more precise. This is a talk show, she said. People watch to hear real answers. Meghan nodded slowly once. And what they often get, she shot back, is rehearsed skepticism dressed up as curiosity. Lorraine inhaled sharply. That's unfair. So is assuming I owe explanations, Meghan replied without hesitation. The temperature in the studio rose perceptibly. The festive decorations, garlands, soft lights, Christmas ornaments, suddenly felt painfully out of place. What had been designed to evoke comfort and cheer now framed a conversation that had turned unmistakably confrontational. Lorraine leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on her knees. Her voice lowered, but the edge was unmistakable. Let me be direct, she said. Some viewers feel you present yourself as a victim while maintaining extraordinary privilege. There it was. The word victim hung in the air like smoke. Meghan didn't respond immediately. She stared at Lorraine, jaw set, eyes unblinking. The silence stretched long enough to feel deliberate, almost surgical. Then she spoke slowly, deliberately, controlled. Pain, she said, doesn't disappear because someone else thinks I should be grateful. Lorraine didn't back down. But privilege shapes perspective, she replied. And people notice when that perspective feels selective. Meghan's voice sharpened. What people notice, she said, is what they're told to notice. Lorraine shook her head slightly. Ew. They notice contradictions. Straightened abruptly, the movement sharp. Contradictions, she repeated, or discomfort. Lorraine met her gaze without blinking. You speak about privacy, she said, yet continue to share intimate details publicly. Something in Meghan shifted. I share on my terms, she snapped. That's the difference. Lorraine's expression hardened. And the public is allowed to question those terms. Meghan let out a sharp laugh this time. Short, humorless, allowed, she said aloud. That word says everything. Lorraine's voice cooled. This is a conversation, she insisted, not a courtroom. Then stop cross-examining me, Meghan fired back. The exchange had lost all pretense of warmth. The studio felt tight, compressed, as if the walls had moved closer. Lorraine crossed her arms. You came here knowing the questions, she said. You don't get to rewrite them halfway through. Meghan's eyes flashed. I get to reject narratives designed to corner me. Lorraine raised her voice. Slightly for the first time. No one is cornering you. Meghan raised hers to match, then stopped pushing. The studio fell into stunned silence. Producers glanced at each other off camera. A stage manager froze mid-step. No one moved. Lorraine broke the pause, her tone clipped now, stripped of softness. "If this conversation is so unbearable," she said, "why agree to it at all?" Meghan stared at her. "Because," she replied coldly, "I believed this would be a respectful space." Lorraine didn't flinch. "And perhaps it was until you decided every challenge was hostility that did it." Meghan stood up abruptly. The movement was sudden enough to draw a sharp intake of breath from somewhere off camera. Her chair shifted slightly behind her. "I will not sit here," Meghan said, her voice tight but controlled, "and be spoken to like this." Lorraine looked up at her, stunned but composed. "No," she said, "this ends now." She stepped back from the sofa, adjusting her jacket with quick, precise movements. The cameras hesitated, then followed. The audience was completely silent, unsure whether to clap, gasp, or stay perfectly still. Lorraine remained seated, her hands folded now, posture rigid. "I'm sorry you feel that way," she said carefully. Meghan turned back, eyes steady. "I don't feel this way," she replied. "I recognize it." Lorraine opened her mouth, then closed it again. The producers' voices murmured faintly through headsets. A red light blinked. "This isn't an ambush," Lorraine said finally. "Intent," Meghan replied, "doesn't cancel impact." Another silence. Aquan looked toward the camera, then back at Lorraine. "For years," she said, "I was told that if I just explained myself enough, I'd be understood. What I learned is that explanation often just feeds entitlement." Lorraine stood now, matching her height. "Interviewing isn't entitlement," she said. "It's accountability." "Accountability," Meghan answered, "is not public dissection." The two women stood facing each other under the studio lights, one representing the structure of broadcast tradition, the other refusing to submit to it. Lorraine exhaled slowly. "We ask questions," she said. "That's the job. And I decide which ones deserve answers," Meghan replied. The director's voice cut faintly through the control room speakers. The segment was collapsing. In real time, Lorraine straightened, professionalism reclaiming her posture. "Thank you for joining us," she said, tone formal now. "We wish you well." Meghan nodded once. "I hope the conversation continues," she said, "just not like this." She turned and walked off stage, heels clicking sharply against the floor. The sound echoed louder than expected. The cameras lingered for a beat too long. Lorraine remained standing, her face composed but tight. "We'll be right back," she said, forcing a smile as the broadcast cut to commercial. But nothing could smooth over what had just happened. No shouting match, no spectacle, no dramatic collapse. It's just a conversation that fractured under the weight of competing authority, one refusing to be questioned on familiar terms, the other insisting those terms still mattered. And long after the lights dimmed and the set reset, one thing was clear to everyone who had watched. This wasn't just an interview gone wrong. It was a format pushed to its limit in a moment when neither side was willing to yield.